Hola, mi nombre es Jaime Hernández, soy profesor de la maestría en paisajes artificiales y adscrito al Departamento de Estética de la Facultad de Arquitectura y Diseño de la Pontificia Universidad Javeriana, y voy a ser su anfitrión hoy. La presentación va a ser en inglés, así que en esta introducción que voy a hacer de la presentación y de nuestro ilustre invitado, voy a usar los dos idiomas. So first of all, I would like to welcome you all. Thanks very much for being here. Today we have a very special guest and very special presentation, Professor Dovey, that I will introduce him in a minute. Before that, I would like to call your attention to the Q&A section tool that we have at the right-hand side of your screens at the top. Please use this icon to make your questions and your comments. You can start now if you wish. At the end of the presentation of Professor Dovey, I will collect all your questions and I will make them to him. I would like to, me gustaría también agradecer a los profesores Ileana Hernández y Raúl Niño, que se encuentran también con nosotros en este momento. Ileana y Raúl son profesores del Departamento de Estética de la Maestría en Paisajes Artificiales igualmente. Y Raúl es además pues, nuestro director de departamento. También está con nosotros ayudándonos y apoyándonos Nathalie Doncel, que es la secretaria, perdón, la asistente del departamento, quien está también muy pendiente de todo lo que suceda hoy. Quería comentarles que este evento hace parte de las distintas actividades que estamos realizando para el lanzamiento del nuevo programa de la facultad, la nueva maestría que se llama Maestría en Paisajes Artificiales. Es una maestría innovadora, transdisciplinaria, que propone un conjunto de conceptos alrededor de la perspectiva de los paisajes artificiales, los cuales se configuran como mundos posibles en evolución a través de procesos de simulación digital, autoorganización y co-creación de devenires edificables que dibujan la frontera entre lo natural y lo artificial. Se expresan en los paisajes virtuales, informales y edificados a través de transformaciones científicas, tecnológicas, artísticas y sociales que modelan diversas complejidades, ecosistemas y lógicas para imaginar horizontes de solución hacia la modelación de ecologías de paisajes contemporáneos poshumanos. Las teorías que ofrece la cuántica, la biología molecular, la vida artificial, la robótica, la computación generan nuevas perspectivas digitales hacia la reflexión del espacio-tiempo, así como las formas indeterminadas de producción social de las comunidades en los entornos populares y las creaciones artísticas y tecnológicas que producen paisajes materializables. Este programa resulta innovador en la formación de nuevos profesionales e investigadores para aportar en los futuros desarrollos que el país y sus regiones demandan. Para más información vamos a pegar en la sección de preguntas y respuestas los links que ustedes pueden consultar si así lo requieren. The master program is organized into 3 different tracks or sessions. One is about what we call virtual landscapes. The other one that is called the build landscape, which is around cities. And the third one is what we call informal landscapes. Precisely is within this third topic or research teaching topic of the master program is that this presentation is about. We have been working in these presentations for around two months, more than 2 months at the moment, presenting different topics, different guests, discussing around different issues in relation with artificial landscapes. And today we have a very special guest, as I was introducing you at the beginning. I'm going to put him online, and I'm going to make his the formal introduction, or Professor Dovey. Well, Professor Dovey, now we have in our screens, is Professor of Architecture and Urban Design at the University of Melbourne, at the where he is also the director of the Informal Urbanism Research Hub. Professor is also a former head of the Architecture and Associate Dean in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. He has published and broadcast widely on social issues in architecture, urban design, and planning. Books include Framing Places, Fluid City, Becoming Places, Urban Design Thinking, and Mapping Urbanities. He currently leads research projects on urban morphology and informal settlements. The presentation is titled Informal Urbanism and Complex Adaptive Assemblage. It's the same title of one of his most well-known papers, I would say, that it's published in the International Development Planning Review. And actually, if you get into the platform, to the website, you will see that his paper is one of the most cited papers in this journal, which I think speaks for itself. Before I give the word to Professor Dovey, I would like to thank him for his generosity. He is broadcasting directly from Melbourne, from Australia, which is 6 a.m., 6 and 10 in the morning. So we're very, very grateful with you, Professor Dovey. Thanks very much again for your time, your generosity with sharing with us this presentation. And last thing before we go with you is to remind all the participants that we have the Q&A section, or the preguntas and respuestas section, that you can put your comments, your questions in there. I will be collecting them, and I will make the comments, the questions, sorry, to Professor Dovey. Professor King Dovey, thanks again. The floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you very much, Jaime, and for everyone who's been involved in organising this. It's very interesting how much more global we've become in many ways under the pandemic, and as we also become much more local. We've all been rather contained to our houses for some time, and yet we also become much more connected globally in many ways. It's winter here, hence still a little bit dark outside. I hope that you have all been keeping safe in these rather difficult times, and that I'm sure we will pull through this. I have I suppose, special thoughts for the residents of informal settlements, many of whom are quite unable to enact the kind of social distancing that most of us are able to do, and are unevenly, in a sense, impacted by the shutdown of street life, because that's where their livelihoods very often are based. I think I want to go straight into sharing the screen, and you'll see a bit more of me when we come back for the Q&A. As Jaime says, this is a presentation that was it's based on a paper that was published around about 12 years ago. No, not 12 years ago. In 2012 it was published. So what's that, 8 years ago? And I'm going to update it a little bit as best I can. Can you confirm that you can see the screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, we can see
All right.
it. Yeah.
So I want to start with an image of an informal settlement in Manila, which is where I was doing some research in February of this year, just before the world closed down. This is a settlement called San Roque, and it's what we might notice about a scene like this will probably depend on our social and class position, but we might notice the kind of mess of electricity wires. We might notice the rather makeshift buildings. We might notice the rather sharp juxtaposition between this settlement and the hotel and office buildings behind. We might notice the level of trading going on. This is a major fresh food market that attracts customers from across this district. It's also a transit hub. The pedicabs and three-wheel tricycles, motorcycle taxis that you see are the major form of public transport in this district. If we look very carefully, we might also see a guard in uniform sitting under a small shelter at the entrance to the settlement. He works for the corporation, the development corporation that developed the office towers and the hotel, and they're in the middle of evicting all of the settlements from all the residents from this settlement in order to turn this site into more middle-class housing. The guard's job is to prevent any building materials from being brought onto the site, because the development corporation wants to paralyse the upgrading process of the settlement. They don't want any new construction to be happening, and that is to make the evictions easier. And the guard also happens to live in the informal settlement. He's a migrant who was displaced from his home in the country due to a typhoon a few years ago, and this is the only affordable housing that he can find. So in a sense, he works for the company that's trying to demolish the place where he lives. So the more questions we ask here, the more complex it gets. So this paper really is about the complexity and the adaptability of this informal settlement process. And that's really just a way of getting into this issue that these settlements are now a thoroughly integrated part of so many cities of the global south. And they can't be simply erased, because we've learned over a fairly long period that the attempts to simply erase them and hope that the formal city will replace them is not going to happen. We have 50 years of experience of trying to do this, and we need to find new ways to think about it. And that's what I've been trying to work on. So if academics have anything to offer here, and I think practitioners have different things to offer, but if academics have anything to offer, it's about inventing new ways of thinking. I want to talk a little bit about what informal means. First of all, this is largely a kind of a theory paper, but I'll come back to some more practical issues towards the end of the lecture. First of all, I think it requires a rethink of what formal and informal mean. The informal sector starts really back in the 1970s, when economists began to notice that so much of the economy was not being captured by the formal figures of gross domestic product and so on. And it was initially called a kind of an informal sector, as if these were different sectors of the economy. And we've learned over the period since that this is really not the case, that there's a thorough integration, both in economic terms, but also in urban terms, between what we might call formal and informal. That formal and informal are not binary relations, that the formal becomes informalized and the informal becomes formalized, that informality is distributed through the city, indeed through all cities, global north cities as well as global south. And there's this integrated relationship. One of the things I think, and this is also not particularly new, goes back to John Turner and others from the 1960s and 70s, is that informality informal settlement, at least, is a form of design and planning. There's a form of agency here. This is the way in which the city is being built. We may cast our architectural and design judgments on the outcomes, but that doesn't mean that it was unplanned. There's a very large number of small decisions being made about how the city can be made to work. There's something of a paradox in this relationship between formal and informal, in that informal settlements are often identified with slums and with squatting. Indeed, are often seen as synonymous with slums and squatting, wrongly in my view, and with the failures of state planning, but they're also identified with a more vibrant and adaptable forms of urban life, and indeed with the right to the city, the idea of there's a positive and a negative side to the questions of urban informality. And I think that we've learned that planning and upgrading, if you want to address the problems of urban informality, it is not going to be addressed by demolition, by eviction, by erasure, but by a better understanding of how urban informality works and how, in particular, how this relationship between formal and informal works. And for me, this requires trying to understand something about informality in itself, not just seeing informality as the lack of formal design, not just the absence of something, but indeed the presence of something. And that something is really about what I'm calling the complex adaptive assemblage. And indeed, this can be seen as a kind of an form of urbanism, a kind of an original form of urbanism. The oldest of cities, indeed the kind of pre-industrial remnants of European cities that are now often the very expensive tourist districts of European cities, are often attractive because of the kind of informal morphogenic process that produced them, along with many holiday destinations such as the Greek islands. But let's move on. I want to spend a minute just defining what urban informality means, and I have to say that this is one of the more vexed questions within this field, because there's an awful lot of people who think they know what it means, and they largely define it as a kind of, it's a euphemism for something that is illegal, or is somehow inferior, or is somehow insecure. So this is really the if you like, the negative side of how we define urban informality. It's the other to the way in which the state establishes legal, formal and secure standards for construction and for urban development. So this is the antithesis, if you like, of the formal. But informal also means other things. This is it also often means irregular, so, which may mean outside the regulations, but also a kind of an irregular morphology, a lack of simply straight lines and grids and so on. That is the way in which informality is detected as an irregular morphology. And it's also got this characteristic of being incremental, that informal settlement is a process of a very large number of very small increments of change. There is no overall master plan. The outcome of the informal settlement process is an emergent process from many incremental decisions. And informality is also often seen and identified with a kind of insurgency. And again, we return here full circle to the idea that urban informality emerges outside the state and in opposition to the state. But as I said in the earlier phases, always in this relationship, this twofold relationship between formal and informal. They cannot be seen separately. This is a model that I call the Six Eyes of Informality, that informality doesn't have a clear definition, and different people have different definitions. The definition of illegal seems to be one that is has more power and more potency, and yet informality means all of these things at the same time and in different locations. But if there's an overall way of trying to understand urban informality, for me, it is about informal urbanism as a mode of production. So I'm very much opposed to the notion that informal settlement is a euphemism or a synonym for the idea of a slum. That substandard urban conditions may indeed be the outcome of an informal settlement process, but it may not. There is such a thing as middle-class informality, and the informality itself is a mode of producing the city. It's a mode that works in a complex relationship with the formal production processes, but nonetheless, it's a mode of production. And it's a mode of production where, in varying degrees, the residents, the citizens who are engaged in informal settlement have a fair degree of control over that mode of production. So the practices of, and when we look at this as a mode of production, we realize that it's got this antinomy or this paradox written through it, where informal settlement is identified with slums, with poverty, and with squatting in some ways, and it's also identified with self-organization and the right to the city in other ways. Before I go to that, I just want to say a couple of things about the way in which practices of informal settlement are fundamentally integrated with an informal economy and an informal politics. So the informal controls become imposed over informal practices, and informal fines and fees and bribes are often paid, votes are bought, and blind eyes are turned. Informal houses and shops and factories are built and inhabited by informal residents and staff. Informal land tenure and home ownership systems evolve, and informal rents are paid. Informal electricity and water is tapped. Informal governance operates within the framework of formal governance. So the task of understanding and rethinking this formal-informal framework is a primary intellectual challenge of our time, and it's one that's multidisciplinary and multi-scale, and it's one that the built environment professions, architecture, landscape architecture, urban design, urban planning, have a key role. It requires approaches and concepts that can incorporate the dynamism of change with a detailed understanding of urban morphology and issues of representation. And in this regard, I want to propose two rather, what I'm arguing are complementary theoretical frameworks. And this is probably the key contribution of this paper, trying to bring together assemblage theory and resilience thinking, or complex adaptive systems theory. First of all, a few notes about assemblage thinking. As developed particularly by Deleuze and Guattari in this wonderful but almost impenetrable book, 1,000 Plateaus, or in a much more accessible way by Manuel de Landa in his book, A New Philosophy of Society. The term assemblage here is a translation of the French agencement, which is akin to a layout, arrangement, or an alignment that suggests at once a dynamic process and a diagrammatic spatiality. So assemblage thinking is related to what is often called relational thinking, to a material turn in social theory, and to a spatial turn in social theory. So it's a turn away from the representational theories that had dominated for so long. I've also suggested elsewhere that assemblage is a useful way of rethinking theories of place in terms of process, of identity formation and becoming. An assemblage is a whole that is formed from the interconnectivity and flows between constituent parts. It's a socio-spatial cluster of interconnections where the identities and functions of both parts and wholes emerge from the flows between them. So it's not a systematic set of predetermined parts that are organised to work in a particular way, but it's a whole that expresses some identity and claims a certain territory. Assemblages are at once both material and representational, and this approach defies any reduction to essence, to textual analysis or materiality. This is not, it's not about reducing the city to its materiality or its spatial form. It's not about reducing it to what it means. It's about connecting these things. So to take an example at the urban design scale, a street is not a thing or a collection of things. The buildings, houses, shops, signs, cops, shoppers, cars, hawkers, rules, sidewalks, the goods, the trolleys, all come together to become the street, but it is an assembled connection between them that is crucial. The relations of buildings to sidewalks to roadway, the flows of traffic, of people, of goods, the interconnections of public to private space and of the street to the city. An assemblage is dynamic. It's the flows of life, traffic, goods and money that gives the street its intensity and its emergent sense of place. And from this view, all cities and parts of cities are assemblages. A key dimension of assemblage thinking is an axis of, and apologies for the jargon, but there is a fair bit of it here, an axis of territorialization and deterritorialization, leading in a turn to a re-territorialization. This is a focus on the concept of territory, the ways social and spatial boundaries are inscribed and erased, the ways identities are formed, expressed and transformed. So territory is a stabilizing assemblage, a zone of order, a sense of home that keeps chaos at bay. The focus is on the process of territorialization, the invasion of the city, the construction of houses, the inscription of boundaries. Informal settlement is a territorialization process. Deterritorialization is the movement by which territories are eroded. Street traders are removed, squatter settlements are demolished, nations indeed are invaded at the larger scale. Deterritorialized elements, building materials and so on can then be recombined into new assemblages through a process of re-territorialization. I think that assemblage theory is a useful framework for understanding the relationship of formal to informal practices in the city, because a range of twofold concepts that resonate with this informal-formal twofold are deployed in this work as a means of understanding assemblages. Informal practices are rhizomic, in contrast with the tree-like strictures of urban regulation and planning. The rhizome with its horizontal connectivity rather than its based on stems like a tree. They involve minor adaptations and tactics in contrast to the major strategies of master planning. They involve informal network connectivity in contrast to hierarchical control. So these twofold pairs form a large part of the conceptual toolkit in the work of Deleuze and Guattari. They are pairs of binary concepts that are defined in terms of each other, where the focus is on the dynamism between them. They cannot be seen as separate nor as dialectic relations, but rather as overlapping and resonating together. Assemblage theory is a theory of socio-spatial change, a theory of societies that is also a theory of cities. And importantly, for the task of understanding urban informality, it incorporates informality as fundamental to understanding the productivity of cities. And it turns away from any notion of informality as some kind of an aberration or a problem that can or should be erased. So assemblage theory is essentially a form of philosophy. It involves a huge amount of jargon and requires a good knowledge of social theory in order to even understand it. It's been particularly poorly understood, I would add, and applied within architectural theory, where it has a wholly other kind of trajectory. To apply such a conceptual framework to urban research, however, is a further task here. And with this in mind, and at the risk of multiplying the complexities, I want to suggest that assemblage theory can be usefully linked to a cluster of other theory known as a complex adaptive systems and resilience. These theories are more widely known and used, but with few exceptions, rarely applied within development studies or to informal settlement practices. This is work that grows out of a mix of theories of mostly mid-20th century theories of cybernetics, chaos theory, complexity theory, and what's grown into resilience theory. Complex adaptive systems theory is an attempt to understand the dynamics of complex systems where the behaviour of the system depends on unpredictable interactions between its parts. While a car or a mobile phone is a complicated system, it's not complex in this sense because its parts work together in a generally predictable manner. When we drive our car, we hope we can predict how it will work. Same thing with a mobile phone. A complex system, on the other hand, is one where the parts adapt to each other in relatively unpredictable ways. They organise themselves, they self-organise. So once a car or a mobile phone is plugged into an urban network, it becomes part of a complex adaptive system that includes both the city and its people. The detailed outcomes of such a system can't be determined in advance, but rather emerge from practices of adaptation and self-organisation, hence emergence theory. Over time, a regime with a certain characteristic emerges and settles down. The regime is what we often call the sense of place. At an urban scale, the emergent properties of the urban system have a lot in common with place identity and with urban character. The resilience of a complex adaptive system is defined as its capacity to adapt to change without slipping into a new regime or identity. And resilience in this sense then is a dynamic capacity to adapt without crossing a threshold of no return. Beyond such a threshold, change can escalate until the system settles into a new regime. One urban example is Jane Jacobs' theory of the self-destruction of diversity, where escalating feedback cycles can destroy the social and formal mix of productive urban neighbourhoods. Jacobs was railing against the monofunctional, top-down, tree-like thinking of modernist master planning, and in pointing out the importance of sidewalk life, of pedestrian connectivity and diversity, etc., she was valorising urban informality, complexity and adaptation as integral parts of how cities work. Informal settlements and informal street markets often settled into forms of resilient yet dynamic stability. And the phrase informal settlement might more aptly be described as a negotiated settlement between informal and formal forces. Resilience theory offers a way of understanding how such processes might be managed with a focus on certain key slow variables. This is one of the stock phrases of resilience thinking. These key slow variables have the potential to push the system across a threshold into a new regime or identity. That's precisely what the Development Corporation in Manila is trying to do with this settlement, incrementally push it over the edge until it can be completely erased and replaced with middle-class housing. In urban terms, such key slow variables may include land and rental value, economic vitality, gentrification, traffic speed and volume, building height and density, social mix, crime, and public transport. For urban informality, these variables may include levels and kinds of democratic governance and political will. As any of these variables change incrementally, other parts of the system adapt. As land rent increases, so does the pressure to displace informal urban practices. As informal settlements are demolished, the displaced residents will then emerge elsewhere. As informal settlers are granted formal tenure, if they are granted formal tenure, they may adapt by selling and moving to other informal settlements, a form of gentrification. If street hawkers are moved along or organised into formalised trading zones, they may well emerge in another part of the network. As increased traffic renders sidewalk trading and social exchange impossible, the trading and the exchange will move elsewhere. So the characteristics of a system that can increase its resilience to regime change are mostly linked to diversity and redundancy. The diversity of the system involves a diversity of possible adaptations to change. Redundancy is the capacity of the system to perform in many different ways, to adapt to change by moving forms, functions, and flows around. Different parts can perform a multiplicity of functions. The tendency to strive for optimum efficiency of the system, which is often the goal of formal planning, can reduce resilience because it leads to a loss of redundancy. So complex adaptive systems are conceived as enmeshed in cycles of change at multiple scales, with four main phases, which they call, I'm drawing here mostly on the work of Holling and Gunderson, but also a particularly interesting book by Walker and Salt called Resilience Thinking. So these cycles of change operate at multiple scales with four main phases called growth, conservation, release, and reorganization, sometimes different words. This cycle draws from the economic theory of creative destruction, originally derived from the economist Schumpeter, and particularly influential in Marxist geographies of people like David Harvey. So capitalism produces cycles of creative innovation that destroys existing structures and territories in order to create new ones. Maybe you can see some similarities here between territorialization and deterritorialization. So growth involves a major phase of development. The initial informal invasion of unused interstitial urban land may be a good example. The conservation phase comes when these gains are significant enough to be conserved and protected. More permanent buildings are constructed, political liaisons are established for protection, and infrastructure is upgraded, and the system becomes more resilient to change. This is a formalization process that can lead to stagnancy and to loss of adaptability. As it becomes more conserved, it becomes rigid. The release phase, if it comes, and it may not, is that brief period when the forces for change overwhelm the place and it crosses a threshold and slips into a new regime. In the case of the informal settlement, this may be when the settlement is demolished and residents are displaced. And then reorganization is a creative period when a new order begins to appear. This may be the formal city that replaces the informal, or it may be the way the residents are either rehoused or rehoused themselves. The settlement may also spiral downwards and stabilize as a dangerous and resilient slum, or it may be incrementally upgraded toward a more formal neighbourhood. A key issue lies in how to define the system. For Gunderson and Holling, all such systems and their cycles of change are enmeshed in multi-scale hierarchies, like in this diagram, which they call a panarchy, where every system becomes a part of systems at a higher scale. These are hierarchies of scale rather than of control, since all systems are mutually interactive. They're clear, as is the case in assemblage theory, that a larger scale does not make it more important or necessarily have more power or control. Power and control flow both up and down. The lower scales may transgress or revolt against the larger scales, where the system in turn remembers and adapts. At the smallest scale, a street trader operates within the space-time system of a particular street or network, with its available locations, codes, fees, customers, and prices. The system can stabilize, but it can also cycle through phases of growth, conservation, removal, reorganization. This is the scale of public-private interfaces, of face-to-face contact. Excuse me. In informal settlements, it's the scale of room-by-room accretions and their social and access networks. At a larger scale, we find the broader patterns of street and traffic networks and the interface between the formal and informal city. The resilience of the system and its emergent properties can only be understood through a multi-scalar approach. Systems can adapt to change by initiating or preventing change at lower and higher levels of the system. Demolition programs might be initiated at the level of the state. Resistance may include sitting in front of the bulldozer, lobbying state politicians, or organising a transnational response through websites. It follows from this multi-scalar approach that the separation and silos between different disciplines, particularly between architecture, urban design, urban planning, landscape architecture, and geography, and also sideways with sociology, anthropology, political economy, and so on. These are artificial differences that need to be integrated in a better way. While I find complex adaptive systems theory to be a useful framework for understanding urban informality in these ways, I also think the term system connotes the kind of top-down controls of the state. The complex adaptive processes that so characterize informal urban development are anything but systematic. So I suggest that the complex adaptive assemblage is a more accurate and useful label for understanding what's going on. Assemblage is also a multi-scalar phenomenon that can be understood at the level of the building, the street, the neighbourhood, the district, and the city. Assemblage has what is often called a flat ontology, meaning that there is no kind of transcendent hierarchy to which the small scale can be reduced to the larger, the particular can be reduced to the general. Assemblage thinking shares with complex adaptive systems the desire to understand such multi-scale relations without reducing the microscale to large-scale processes and structures. Both frameworks oppose any privileging of change from above and focus on understanding the relations and dynamics between scales, particularly the ways that many small-scale adaptations can produce synergistic emergent effects at higher levels. While the higher levels of assemblage may be identified with the state and institutions of governance, they can't be seen as separate assemblages. While an informal settlement can be identified and territorialized as a discrete assemblage, so we often use that as a noun, it is also assembled as a verb through its multi-scale connections with the political economy of the city, the nation, and the globe. And such multi-scale thinking is inherently interdisciplinary. It requires we think across the fields of geography, urban planning, and so on. Before I return to some kind of conclusion, I want to digress a little bit and show some of the work that I've been doing with my colleagues, with my students, in trying to apply this kind of approach. So while the connections might not always be obvious. I also want to say that my sense is that assemblage thinking is a toolkit for engaging with these complex problems much more than it is a solution for understanding them. So in a sense, it is the means rather than the end. Well, the paper I'm presenting here today is a theory paper. Most of the time I'm engaged in trying to make theory disappear. Now that may seem strange after delivering all of that theory in a way that doesn't disappear. I think when you actually engage with research, most of the time you are trying to communicate with an audience who is not interested in this theory. They're actually interested in the problem, and I share that interest. So my sense is to try and use these concepts and ideas as tools for understanding that, like any job, once you've dug the hole, the shovel disappears. So I wanted to show just some of the ways in which this pans out, and the connections between them might become sources of questions. I don't know. One of them is a project I'll call Metropolitan Mapping. I did with a colleague Hessam Malapur, and this was a means of trying to understand the varieties of informal settlement and try to understand that formality is not a binary. Formal, informal is not a binary condition, that there are many kinds of mixed informal settlements. And so using a particular typology, we mapped a range of cities, including Jakarta. And here the most yellow are the kind of highly informalized settlements that are most often typically cast as informal settlements. The very dark brown is the formal city, and the mid-browns are all various kinds of mix. I'm going to go through this very quickly because we're not going to have time. That they include some cities closer to you, such as Medellin. And you see very different patterns of formal and informal emerging in different cities. Caracas, the kind of escarpment-based settlements for the most part. Cairo, it's mostly agricultural land converted into various forms of mixed and other informalities. In Nairobi, again, one of the lessons from this is that the land area covered by mixed settlements is far greater than that in the stereotyped informal settlements. Lima. There are papers that back this up, so you can explore this work in more detail in other ways. I've also become very interested in the urban design and planning processes of urban informality and trying to understand the morphogenesis of informal settlements. How do urban design decisions get made? How do the street widths get established? How does the street network get established? What is the relationship between architecture and urban design in the process of informal development? So the Morphogenesis project, which I've been doing again with a number of students and colleagues, is based on trying to map and understand, in this case using Google Earth data, the ways in which different settlements develop over time, and what are the increments of change, and how do the street network formed, and how does it intensify over time. That's a settlement in Lima. This is a settlement in Manila. In this case, it's water that is drained and filled in. And so from 2003 through 2005, 2007, the settlement develops. And I would return here to my point that these are now highly likely very permanent settlements. So that this is, in the sense that urban design, the decisions of urban design last a lot longer than decisions about urban planning and architecture. This is the way in which the city, the informal city, is being produced, in the sense that plans can always be changed and architecture can be demolished. The street network very rarely gets changed. That's the Manila settlement. This is a different project. focusing on the increments of change. Most of this work is now published or almost published. Here we were zooming down to the smaller scale and asking questions about what the increments of change in informal settlements are as rooms are added, staircases are added, sometimes formal structures are filled in. This is the same place at 2 periods of time where you see the very often almost imperceptible changes through which informal settlements emerge. And we're particularly interested too in the way in which settlements can incrementally develop into substandard conditions where what might be a reasonable plan at one point becomes, through a series of what you might call overdevelopment, it develops into substandard conditions. So we're interested in the codes and the informal codes that operate, because there are always rules, not formal rules, but informal rules that govern particularly rights of access and rights of way, and the negotiations between residents about what forms of development are possible and what enables public space to become entunneled in this way. We've also been interested in questions of image and visibility. You might recognise the images on the left, particularly the ways in which some of the really quite exemplary projects from Median have changed not only the forms of access of informal settlers to the city, but the way in which it also changes the access of middle classes and tourists into the informal settlement, and changes the relations of visibility between classes within the city. And I've been interested in the various tactics to change the way in which informal settlements work in the visible field of the urban landscape, various kinds of art projects, but also the uses of visibility by informal settlements to resist change, or the uses of settlements and colours. The pink buildings on the right there are actually somebody's political brand. A politician is trying to brand the settlement according to his own pink version of upgrading. Or again, back in Medellin, the kind of upgrading which incorporates various kinds of house painting, which is geared in turn to questions of slum tourism, which I know Jaime has also been studying. There's been some projects on eviction and upgrading. This one is in Indonesia, but particularly focused on the role of settlement communities in trying to take some charge of the image of their own settlement, and indeed portraying themselves as urban upgraders, in this case putting up small billboards showing how they have improved the way in which the city looks. There's a little project on the half houses being produced by Elemental down in Chile, done here with Sandra Carrasco and David O'Brien, asking this question about how informality and formality can intersect in various kinds of, this is not an upgrading project, it's really an approach to harnessing the practices of informal infill to a more formal architecture. And finally, back to this little project in Manila, where this settlement is being threatened, and some of the students, I took 15 students to Manila in February, and they were engaged in trying to do this. This is a rather slightly dangerous task in some ways, because flying in for a couple of weeks with a bunch of students can be a recipe for them simply bringing their own ideologies to the forms of settlement upgrading. But here I've been encouraging them to adopt a more analytic approach before moving into design, looking at the ways in which a constellation of informal settlements occupies an area and indeed provides the employment, and their livelihoods are engaged across a larger area. And here we're looking at what we call the transport trading settlement assemblage, looking at settlement, transport and trading together, and then focusing in on a particular settlement and looking at what the urban and architectural futures of this settlement might be, as you perhaps even concede that parts of it are going to be demolished, but that the public spaces need to be upgraded, that new housing needs to be constructed in conjunction with trying to keep the morphologies of some parts of the settlement, and indeed focusing down on very much smaller sites and looking at the idea of incremental change in architectural terms, inventing building types and looking at the ways in which different communities how we might understand this incremental process and work with it rather than against the incremental processes of producing the city. So, and then focusing a kind of an analytic about density on this too, because issues of density are fundamental to the ways in which informal settlements work. And that is some of the references that might be useful there. And I want to just conclude here for a few minutes with trying to round this back to some of the theory, and then we can have some questions. So from an urban design perspective, this kind of thinking, it strikes me, is not really new. And it's now many years since Christopher Alexander wrote his very seminal paper, "A City is Not a Tree." Every student at the city needs to read that. It was a fundamental insight that continues to inform and transform urban thinking after nearly half a century. A key to this insight was that the informal lateral connections between the parts of the city are crucial to the way in which cities work. And likewise, the seminal urban writings of Jane Jacobs are replete with the valorization of informal connections at every scale, from her eyes on the street to the productivity and creativity of larger urban economies. What they were describing could be called a complex adaptive assemblage. So what might this framework mean for the ways we approach urban informality in terms of rethinking the city in research methodology and policy development? So I think, first of all, assemblage can help to rethink the formal-informal framework. It's clear just how intermeshed formal and informal processes are in all urban assemblages, even those that might appear to be highly formalized or informalized. This informal-formal conception is both fundamental and non-dichotomous. It's a single twofold concept rather than two concepts in opposition. While it often appears that the formal city comes first and the informal insinuates itself into the interstices, this can also be seen the other way around, that formal urbanism or urban planning, as often called, is what happens to informal urbanism when it's seen as a problem that needs to be fixed. In this regard, it's crucial to maintain a distinction between slums and informality. Slums are a problem caused by poverty, and informality is often the means by which poverty is managed. Go back to that slide. Urban informality is too often either demonized as the virus that must be removed, or it's romanticized as the entrepreneurial poor lifting themselves up by their bootstraps. There's nothing essentially good or bad about urban informality. The crucial questions lie in the myriad ways in which the formal and informal intersect. Much crime, violence, and corruption is informal, and the informal sector can also operate in synergies with state and market oppression. The informal economy can drain the tax base necessary for effective regime change. And to understand urban assemblages, to design, regulate effectively within them requires a complex understanding of the factors that drive regime change. We might wish to limit the forces for change, or we may wish to drive the system into a new and better regime, which is what upgrading is often called. There's nothing essentially good about urban resilience. Corruption and poverty can be highly resilient to change. The concept of resilience has currency across the fields of social, economic, and environmental sustainability, and there are some interesting intersections between them. Informal settlements have arguably the lowest carbon footprint of any form of urbanism on the planet. They use recycled materials at high densities with low-rise morphologies. They're close to employment and they have very low car dependency. There's a good deal we can learn from informal urbanism in this regard. So how can we best understand and engage with informal settlement as complex adaptive assemblage? Assemblage thinking is inherently multiplicitous. It implies a multiplicity of methods of analysis at multiple scales and from multidisciplinary perspectives. My own work, as I have shown, is focused on the forms and morphologies of informal settlement as a verb. While dramatic images of informal settlements often appear on the book covers, most studies of informal settlements are relatively aspatial. They don't look much at the form. The forms of informality are mostly written off as superficial symptoms of larger socio-political forces. Yet the morphologies and images of informality matter, and they matter to the residents who produce them and to the politicians and the middle classes who want them erased or formalised, who don't want to have to look at them. It is seen as a kind of failure to implement law and order. So finally, what difference might assemblage thinking make to practices of urban planning, governance and upgrading? While the upgrading of settlements clearly involves a formalisation, it also can incorporate informal practices. We need forms of governance that can engage with the paradox of informality, that can operate across both formal and informal sectors, where the informal sector formalises and the formal sector adapts to the realities of informality. We need policy that is flexible and adaptive, that mirrors and accommodates the processes of informality. And while there are dangers that flexibility can be a cover for corruption and runaway deregulation, it's clear that older models of comprehensive master planning will fail. This is the great challenge for the urban planning profession, how to move toward a model that accepts unpredictability and informality without surrendering to the ravages of market-led ideology of neoliberal capitalism. How to plan for the eradication of poverty in a manner that doesn't kill the vitality, the productivity, and the adaptability that sustains the livelihoods of the urban poor. How to formalise the city without erasing the complexity and the adaptability. So thank you very much, and we'll have some Q&A.
Professor Dovey, thanks very much. Thanks very much for your interesting presentation. Very much in line also with what we are thinking and try to develop in our master program, specifically in what we call informal landscapes, in relation particularly with self-organization, co-production, multiplicity, uncertainty, and some other of the concepts that you elaborated. I have gathered some questions. I'm gonna put you live now. As I said, I gathered some questions. I think I can organize them into 3 different parts or sessions. First, 4 questions are around they're asking if you can give a more elaborate those concepts a little bit more, and I'm gonna tell you what the questions are. One is about the chaos theory and informal settlements. If you could elaborate this a little bit more. Another question is about diversity, social emergence, and adaptation. That you mentioned that to some extent, these 3 concepts or 3 identification can go beyond normal, but how they can go beyond normal without getting normalized or without being normalized. The third related question, I would say, is that they're asking if you can elaborate again a little bit more about interconnectivity and assemblage with a particular example, a street or something like that. And the fourth question also, I think, is kind of linked with the previous ones, is about diversity and complexity in informal settlements. If you can say more about this.
Do you mind repeating the first question?
Yes. If you can elaborate more about the chaos theory and informal settlements.
About theory and informal settlements.
The chaos theory.
Say that again. I can't. It's the accent.
Yes, yeah, my problem. Chaos.
Okay, chaos theory and assemblage. Okay.
Yes, and informal settlements.
Yeah. I can't entirely answer these questions clearly, so I need to to pull the rug out a little bit first, because in many ways many of these questions are about, can I be clearer about the theory? And the answer is that perhaps I can't. I'm not sure, but I'll try and address them. Chaos theory and assemblage. Chaos theory really comes out, it's part of a cluster of theory that comes out of the mid-20th century, when so much of the work on cybernetics and information theory was emerging, and philosophers, but also other people such as anthropologists. Gregory Bateson was a key. He was an anthropologist who was a key figure in understanding that that the way in which societies work could be understood through this lens of trying to understand information. And he had this wonderful phrase where he said that information is the difference that makes a difference. That simply understanding what he means by that, I think, is one of the key insights to this kind of thinking. That what he was saying, and that links back to the work of some of the American pragmatist thinkers such as William James, who said that part of the task is to make sense of this world of what he described as a blooming, buzzing confusion, that out of this world of so many different things, of differences, we select certain differences and we call that information, or we call that an identity. So that's a roundabout way of describing this, but chaos theory and information theory, and so much of that work from the mid-20th century, it seems to me, has coalesced into, I mean, chaos theory was the great kind of trope of chaos theory was the idea that that a butterfly on one part of the world could cause a storm on the other side. That somehow this was a retreat from trying to understand the world in terms of discrete cause-effect relations, and that there was no clear science that could say what the outcomes of particular actions would be, because chaos, which is not be one of my preferred terms because I think it's so easily misunderstood, and I'm no expert on chaos theory, but that chaos implies disaster, it implies a complete lack of order, and that's not what's being really implied there. Assemblage theory is not a form of chaos theory. It's a theory that tries to understand the way in which the world works, and it's a theory of interconnectivity, which is the third question here, which was about saying more about that. To some degree, I get to the limits of, there's many things that one can say about assemblage theory, and I don't regard myself really as the expert on that. I do notice that many other people draw different conclusions by reading the same theory, and I would note that Deleuze and Guattari did not call their work a theory. That they were reluctant to be as definitive as that, and I think that they were right. That I prefer to think of it as assemblage thinking. Their argument was that what philosophy does is to create concepts which are tools for thinking, and that the real test is not whether the theory can be made to stand and have all of its contradictions removed. This is, in as much as it's a theory that's replete with contradiction, and indeed with a lot of obfuscation and unclarity. Now, one can criticize it for that and for its jargon, as I often do, or one can try and use what one can from the theory, and that's been my approach, is that there's large parts of Deleuze and Guattari's thinking that I don't find useful, and there are large parts that I do find useful, but I think it's the usefulness that is the criterion. I'm going to try and get around these questions. Talked a little bit about chaos theory and assemblage. Interconnectivity is of course linked to that. The idea that it is the connections between things. I'm often looking for ways to try and convey this to students, and one of the reasons I put the books on the last slide was that in many ways, if you want to know more about what I think about this, I think it's in those books. The book Urban Design Thinking is written for students. It is a theory of assemblage as applied to cities, masquerading as a kind of textbook. And in that, I have tried to both be as clear as I can about the final chapter of that book is called Complex Adaptive Assemblage, and is probably the clearest account I can give of this framework of complex adaptive assemblage applied to cities in general, not just to informal settlements. And I'm in there constantly trying to harp on the idea that you are looking at relationships rather than things. I think there has been, particularly with my background in architecture, I think we are easily steeped in the idea that we're looking at objects and we are designing objects, we're designing things. And I understand that it can be quite a pragmatic approach. You know, if you want to design a house, you tend to treat it as a thing. But really what matters is the relations between things, but also between people and things. So you are always looking at interconnectivity, and there's no easy boundary because everything is connected to everything else. And there's a danger with assemblage thinking that it becomes to mean everything, and therefore it means nothing. It's part of the reason that I've tried to, in a sense, make, in a lot of my work, I try to make the theory disappear. I try and do publishing without talking about assemblage, and I regard it as a kind of ambushing, really, that if you can help people to understand the way that the city works without a lot of French jargon, then perhaps that's some kind of achievement. The other questions, someone asking me to talk more about diversity, emergence and adaptation, and the final question was also about diversity and complexity. So in many ways, this clump of questions, it seemed to me to say, well, I've introduced a lot of concepts that are a bit difficult to understand. Can I explain them a bit more clearly? Again, I would point you to the last chapter of Urban Design Thinking, but I'd also say, maybe say a little bit about diversity. I'm not a huge fan of the word diversity, but I understand that it's a well understood word. For me, diversity is a more simple way of saying something that is often regarded as jargon, which is multiplicity. so an assemblage is, in a sense, multiple, and it's the multiplicity of it that in a sense goes to the heart. It's it is many different things. So an assemblage approach is one that prioritizes difference over identity. So this again is a philosophical distinction that's really crucial to understanding Deleuze. Deleuze is suggesting that most philosophy, going all the way back to Aristotle, has prioritized identity over difference, that in a sense we see identities and we regard them as fundamental. So, you know, we see the house or the table or the pen as primary, and its relationship to writing or to living as somehow secondary. But he's saying that it's differences that are primary, that the world is a field of differences out of which it is this, William James puts it, this blooming, buzzing confusion. And it is a field of differences out of which we construct simple and sometimes simplistic identities. So the concept of diversity is linked to this prioritization of difference over identity, and the idea that an assemblage is a multiplicity of differences, and that you are never going to get to the bottom of this. So I have, when I'm looking at an informal settlement, I try to remind myself that I can never understand it. In many ways, it's a reminder of the old Socratic principle that Socrates is more famous than any philosophy that he ever really propounded, was his statement that the one thing I know is I know nothing. That in a sense, knowledge comes from knowing how little you know, and that all of his the Socratic dialogues were premised on the idea that knowledge would emerge from dialogue, from a relationship, and particularly a relationship between people who disagree, a relationship of differences, and that's where I think that the question of diversity comes in here, and that links a lot into complex adaptive systems theory, where some really key thinkers, in many cases scientists who've been studying, you know, forests and natural systems, and realized that they cannot see those systems separately from the social, political and economic systems that they're enmeshed, that they are not separate, and that it's the diversity of species and the diversity of relations, and indeed the redundancies of interrelations that embody the resilience. That the resilience is this a kind of an adaptability, this capacity to adapt, and informal settlements have that in spades. I'm going to leave that as a collective response to those questions, Jaime, if that's all right.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Professor. I have, well, there are a couple of questions about territorialization and re-territorialization. I'm going to read one by one attendee, Isaac Salgado, that to some extent, I think, to sum up both of these questions. I'm going to read it. It says, could you elaborate more into de-territorialization and re-territorialization? As far as I understand, the proposal of Deleuze-Guattari is to de-territorialize, as it does not mean the subject is lost. Otherwise, leads the subject to change. In that sense, informality would be a mode of production of the subject, not the city, by de-territorializing the city, outside stability. That also would lead to a different understanding of the right of the city.
Okay, again, I can't really promise to have a clear answer, but I can talk a little bit about that relationship of deterritorialization, re-territorialization. This, in many ways fits into the set of twofolds that Deleuze and Guattari invent as a framework for thinking about assemblages. It's linked to another distinction between smooth and striated space, which is the title of one of their the chapters in the book, one of the more interesting chapters, really. The deterritorialization, reterritorialization, and then a subsequent deterritorialization is one of the it's a dynamic that is pointed out, and it has a lot in common with the cycles of change talked about in resilience thinking. Deleuze and Guattari have a profound tendency right through their work to stress and to prioritize one side of this twofold over the other, and it is always the informal. The informal is not a word they use. It is the rhizomic over tree-like thinking. It is supple over rigid. It is minor over major. It is smooth over striated, and it is deterritorializing over reterritorializing. My sense is that this is largely political, because they also contradict themselves in some ways by saying that this that it is never one or the other, that it is always both, and that it is always, in a sense, one replacing the other. Their stress on the, if you like, the underside of this, the rhizomic over tree-like thinking, is that this is that's where the imbalance is in the world, that the world is dominated by tree-like thinking, by hierarchic thinking, by reducing, by a form of reductionism, where things are reduced to essences and to tree-like thinking and to hierarchies. So they're always railing against that. There's a very powerful kind of a politics. It's a politics of lateral connectivity over top-down control. And I understand that. This is, in many ways, a theory of power. So Deleuze and Guattari's theory, in as much as it's the theory, is in many ways a theory of power that is based in earlier work by Foucault, who was a friend of Deleuze. And Deleuze takes Foucaultian notions of power, which are very much about disciplinary power, and says, but they're not all negative, that in a sense that Foucault gives a very good account of the ways in which micro practices of power work to construct subjects and to construct truth effects, but that that this can also be used in highly positive ways as well. And so in many ways, I see the work 1,000 Plateaus as a theory of power. It's sometimes accused by its advocates as avoiding questions of power, and I think that's really quite wrong. But this is a theory of power operating both top-down and bottom-up, and indeed strongly based on Foucaultian notions of power. They tend to stress that bottom-up, for want of a better phrase, the rhizomic forms of power, and I understand that. I don't entirely agree with it. I think that it's much more productive to not to valorize one side of this or the other, but to stick with that kind of between condition. So in that sense, I would say that they do prioritize deterritorialization over reterritorialization. Then I would say it's better not to put a value on either of those, but to understand and to ask the question of what's at stake in any of these processes, because sometimes resilience means resisting a kind of deterritorialization. It means consolidating the gains that have been made. It seems to me so much progress in human history does rely on that consolidation phase where you make gains and you consolidate them, that there's a certain territorialization which is sometimes enlisted in legislation and highly formal territories, if you like, that are really profoundly important to establishing a base for people's livelihoods and a capacity to then move on and indeed to establish more progressive change. But one can read Deleuze and Guattari with the sense that everything is about erasing boundaries and about deterritorializing. And to me, this is the way in which they leave themselves open to appropriation by neoliberal capitalist ideology. That it's the kind of deregulation that can be read from assemblage thinking can be seen as quite consistent with that kind of global neoliberal capitalism. And I think that's a particularly unfortunate outcome of this. I mean, in architecture, for instance, there's quite a profound movement in architecture to produce an architecture that is seen as somehow consistent with Deleuzian thinking, and yet is also profoundly consistent with the kind of new kinds of power exerted by neoliberal capitalism. So I don't know if that's quite an answer to that, but I think that is a point of contention that is being asked in that last question. For me, the lesson is to look hard at what is being deterritorialized, and the question of whether or not deterritorializing or reterritorializing is a good thing is a fairly open question. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not.
Thanks very much, Professor Dovey. I have the last section of questions. I have 4. They are, I think, more specific. Not so sure if they connect each other, but here we are. One of them, first of them, is if you could say more about the relationship between your theory or your argument about complex adaptive assemblage and the theory of Jane Jacobs that you mentioned at some point. Second question is if the idea of trying to understand this informal urbanism from different perspectives, conceptually and empirically, is such as diversity, emergence, dynamic systems, and so on, the idea is to try to understand them from different sources, and then with this new or better understanding, try to get some better responses to these places or better interventions to these places. That was the second question. The third question is what would you say, or what would you consider is the contribution of informality in terms of architecture and urban design to the urbanization in general, to the theory of urban, if we can say so. So what's the contribution of these settlements around the global south, particularly, to a more general or to a more global understanding of cities? And the fourth and final question is if you see any difference in informal settlements in South Asia, as you were researching and publishing about, and in Latin America, that we noticed that you've done some work in Venezuela and Medellin particularly. If you see differences or they're very much the same apart from the context.
Okay. I might tackle questions, the first and the third together. The first was about Jacobs and complex adaptive assemblage, and the third was about the contribution of this kind of thinking to general theories of architecture and urban design, because I think they come together. Jacobs was a disarmingly simple writer. You know, she wrote in a way, she actually wrote, strangely, she wrote for architecture journals. She didn't write for urban planning journals. She was fairly anti-planning. She wrote for architecture journals, and she wrote in a very ordinary way designed to appeal to architects, and then her writing became more popular and she put it into a book and so on. And I think of her as an assemblage thinker because she was always thinking about the interconnections. And it's the Death and Life of Great American Cities, also a very strange title, because it's really a theory of urban design in general. In her last chapter, there's the final chapter, which is called The Kind of Problem a City, something like The Kind of Problem a City Is. And she was actually getting a little bit more theoretical, and she was looking at, she's writing in the mid-20th century as all of these various other theorists looking at information theory and cybernetics and so on were, and she could see these theories of emergence emerging, if you like, and she was drawing the dots, even though this work was not really the instigation of her way of thinking. She, her work was empirical, but not empirical in the sense of an empirical science. It was empirical in the sense of spending a lot of time on the streets and asking, how does this work? What's going on here? And it was also very political in the sense of being, she was very active in opposition to major urban planning decisions, and she was pointing out the illogicality of so much that passed for rational planning. She was basically saying it's not rational, that indeed our theories of how cities work are not good enough, and so on. I don't think she's the only one, but she's the one whose legacy has lasted, and I think that her work has now been reduced to formula in so many different ways that she would really be aghast. But nonetheless, a careful reading of Jacobs, I think, says that she opened the door onto how cities work in general, and that in that sense, hers is a theory of urban informality. She is saying that cities are produced by people putting out garbage bins and engaging in what she called a place ballet, by people looking out of windows and establishing certain forms of safety on streets across urban interfaces. And then she's linking that to the much larger scale ideologies of urban planning. And it's just a major kind of seminal work. And I don't think, by the way, that we have even seen that work exploited all that much. Some of my work has been on this recent paper called What is Walkability, which is, for whoever asked this question might be interesting, because with my colleague Alec Tufka, we have been trying to take some of that work much further in terms of establishing much better forms of investigation of urban density. I think we know very little about urban density. She didn't even call it density. She called it concentration, you know, and which is just another word for density, the ways in which people and buildings and things become concentrated in small areas. So I think that that there are there will be lessons, many lessons from the global south for the global north on this, because so much of what you learn by looking at lessons from highly informalized cities are going to be very useful for highly formalized cities. So my own view is, and again, taking that kind of middle view, I think that a lot of cities of the global south are what you might call over-informalized, and a lot of cities of the global north are over-formalized. Cities of the global north lack adaptability. They lack resilience in many ways. There's this whole movement towards what's variously called temporary and tactical urbanism in cities of the global north, where young designers, for the most part, trying to add new forms of creativity and innovation to the design and transformation of public space, sometimes in a very much more bottom-up way, guerrilla urbanism and do-it-yourself urbanism and so on. and this is seen as one of the big isms of the time. If you go to most cities of the global south, this is just the way things have been done for a long period of time. So this is in some ways the global north learning from the global south, and I think that what we learn from informal urbanism in the global south does migrate as well into our thinking about global north cities, and hopefully in the long term, possibly the very long term, there are benefits for both in our understandings here. This sort of leads on to the second question, which was about the ways in which various kinds of empirical and other approaches to informal urbanism might lead to better kinds of responses and interventions in the city. I think we hope for that. My sense is that that will happen. I think this is a very slow process. I don't think it's not a matter of a piece of research revealing the way in which things should be done, and then everyone will see the light and start to do them that way. These sort of the urban planning processes are deeply intermeshed, and again, there's assemblage thinking means that nothing is kind of excluded, so that the researcher is part of that assemblage, as is the practitioner, and as are we. You know, we're enmeshed in an academic assemblage right now. So these interventions, I think, will improve. I showed a little bit of the work of students, not because I think it's like an end point or an answer, but because I think that the design imagination is going to become extremely important to how we proceed here, and it can't be simply an imagination of a fixed outcome. So I've been encouraging students to think about process and to find ways of using design to imagine different scenarios, or to set up rule systems that are where that you can replicate and somehow model the way in which an informal development process operates. I have met quite a few academics who are into agent-based modeling and various kinds of parametric design, who say, yes, that's the way to go, and I'll believe that when I actually see some of that actually works. I mean, I would be encouraging of it, but for the most part, that's not what I do. But I do think that some of that stuff shows quite a lot of promise. But I do think that the design professions in particular need to turn away from a focus on formal critique of fixed outcomes, as if the task of designing is about figuring out the final form and simply making it as beautiful as we can, or as, if you like, as tight and succinct as we can. This is not a kind of process where there is a fixed outcome. This is an adaptive process that has certain rules, and where whatever the outcome is at one moment in time, it will be adapted at the next moment. So the fixation of architecture in particular on the formal object is a deeply held ideology that it would be easy enough to critique intellectually. But I would also say that I think that that's where architecture's particular niche in the economy works, that architecture largely fills a role at the moment in providing symbolic capital for a meaning market, which is a different kind of critique that I was writing about a long time ago, and that the sources of that, the book Framing Places, was largely about that kind of stuff. The last question was about differences between South and Southeast Asia and Latin America. The work I've been doing, and particularly the current work on morphogenesis, is trying to get some global perspective on what's going on. I'd say it's not just about South and Southeast Asia and Latin America, and there's Africa and various parts of the Middle East as well. So what are the differences and similarities? So I'd say they're certainly not all the same, but most attempts to characterize regional differences are also a little bit, to me, over stereotyped. It's relatively easy to say that a lot of the Latin American settlements are escarpments, and that's true enough, but a lot of them are not as well. And it's there are other, if you like, patterns. There's a pattern that I sometimes call the infubub, which is like the informal suburbs that are emerging around the edges of sub-Saharan African cities, and that's a relatively strong pattern as well. But I think it's too easy to jump into stereotypes. There's the South African shack settlement, but again, it's a kind of a stereotype. So there are important differences, and they're geared to important political differences. They're geared to climatic differences. They're geared to topographic differences. A lot of the Southeast Asian settlements are water-based, meaning that they operate on in monsoon areas where there's a lot of relatively land that is rendered marginal because of its rather watery conditions and subject to flooding and so on. And then different morphogenic patterns emerge in relation to that. So there's really quite a lot of differences, a lot of social differences, a lot of political differences, and trying to understand those differences is as important as understanding the similarities.
Okay, thanks very much, Professor Dovey. We are closing now. I would like again to thank you for your generosity and sharing with us, with our audience, your work, your ideas, your research work. Very interesting. There are several publications that we can follow your work, and I think many of us will do in the future. So I'm closing now. I would like also to thank all the audience. Gonna switch into Spanish now. Quisiera agradecer a todos los que participaron en esta reunión. Muchas gracias nuevamente al profesor Dovey por su conferencia, por sus ideas, por sus comentarios. Quisiera también agradecer a Iliana, a Raúl y a Natalie, coorganizadores de esta conferencia, que estuvieron pues permanentemente pendientes en la realización de la misma. Nuevamente invitarlos a que se acerquen a la maestría en paisajes artificiales. Están colocados allí los links para que ustedes los exploren, los circulen si estiman a bien hacerlo. Y quería invitarlos particularmente al próximo seminario permanente de la maestría, que será el próximo miércoles, miércoles 24 de junio, en 15 días, a las 2:30 de la tarde. Vamos a tener al profesor y decano de la Facultad de Educación de la Javeriana, Félix Gómez, con el tema Paisajes inteligentes no humanos. So again, thanks very much to all of you. Professor Dovey, very grateful. Thanks very much and all the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dovey. Bye.
Thank you for organizing this. And how many people did you have?